They never meant to be cruel. At least, that was the story she told herself for years. The explanation that softened the edges of her disappointment and kept her from naming it outright. Her family wasn't loud with their neglect, nor were they intentionally spiteful. It wasn't the sharp, pointed comments of a fight, the shouting that leaves ears ringing long after the words are gone. It was quieter than that, subtler, woven into the rhythm of their lives in a way that left her feeling absent without ever being explicitly erased. Every year it followed the same pattern. Invitations would circulate, gatherings announced, plans made. She would scan the messages, the emails, the group chats, and find that she was always missing. Not by accident, not entirely, but in a way that made her question herself endlessly. Maybe she had misread the message. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. Perhaps they assumed she was busy. She would try to tell herself these things while the ache settled somewhere behind her chest, quiet but persistent, like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. At first, it was sharp. The first Christmas she wasn't included had left her stunned, unsure how to respond. She remembered sitting in her room, staring at her phone as the messages rolled in from cousins, aunts, and uncles who were so excited about family dinner. They all assumed she knew the schedule, that she had somehow failed to show up, that she was fine with being left out. Fine. The word had rung in her mind with bitter irony. She wasn't fine. The idea that she could be invisible in a family she loved, that her absence would go unnoticed or unquestioned, had cut deeper than she could have imagined. She had called once, hesitated, tried to sound casual when she asked if she had missed a plan. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a polite hesitation, and then some vague excuse about scheduling or miscommunication. They didn't apologize. They didn't admit that she had been forgotten. They didn't acknowledge the pattern that would continue quietly year after year. And she hung up, swallowing the lump in her throat, telling herself it didn't matter, that she could handle it, that it was probably for the best. But it always returned. Every year, the same small wound opened again. Photos posted online, videos from the gathering, faces smiling, tables set, the crackling of a fire in the background, laughter frozen into images she could scroll past but never touch. She could see herself in these moments, not in person, but as the shadow of her own expectation. And each time she felt a little more invisible, a little more accustomed to the idea that her presence was optional in the eyes of those who claimed to care about her. It wasn't dramatic. There was no explosive confrontation. There was no grand declaration that she was unwanted. Just a slow, persistent erosion of recognition. The quiet omission that left her questioning her worth and place in the family. For a while, she tried to compensate. She would send gifts early, notes with warm wishes, little reminders that she was thinking of them, participating from the periphery in ways that might go unnoticed. She would call ahead, offering to help cook or clean or set up, even when they didn't ask. She learned to laugh off the small slights, to make jokes about being the invisible daughter, to play her role with a lightness that hid the weight pressing on her chest. But laughter is a fragile shield. Behind it lingered the dull ache of exclusion, the realization that no matter how kind or accommodating she was, she could not manufacture acknowledgement where it was absent. Her attempts to bridge the gap never changed the pattern. Invitations would still circulate without her name, holiday plans would unfold without notice. The quiet omission continued, each repetition a subtle reminder that she was not central to the family she had grown up believing was her home. The psychological weight of being quietly excluded is different from outright conflict. A fight is obvious. You see the damage and the world confirms it. You can name it, argue it, even walk away from it. Quiet exclusion, by contrast, seeps in, erodes, and makes the target question not just their place, but their perception of themselves. Was she imagining it? Was she too sensitive? Was it possible she had done something to deserve being left out? She knew rationally that these were lies her mind repeated to preserve her sense of order, but feeling them, night after night, year after year, was inevitable. The ache of exclusion became a companion, one that whispered that she was unworthy, unimportant, replaceable. It didn't demand attention, it didn't shout, it only existed in the spaces between the words and the gestures that never arrived, a persistent absence that was more tangible than many of the presences in her life. She began to notice patterns outside the holidays as well. Invitations to dinners, to family milestones, to celebrations of all kinds came late or not at all. When she did attend, she was subtly reminded of her outsider status, the quiet ways in which her family assumed she would conform to the background. Compliments were backhanded, questions were loaded with expectation, and conversations shifted as though she had no right to be central. Over time, she internalized the pattern, learning to brace herself for the disappointment. Every year as the calendar approached the season she loved and feared in equal measure, a familiar tightness would coil in her chest, a signal she knew well. It was anticipation and dread intertwined, indistinguishable. What is remarkable about quiet exclusion is its invisible rigor. It doesn't require dramatic displays, it doesn't leave fingerprints, and yet it leaves a mark deeper than the sharpest argument, because it forces you to contend not only with the absence of others, but with the absence of acknowledgement of that absence. She learned to navigate it with grace, to smooth over her own hurt so that it would not disturb the surface of their lives, to smile politely when photos appeared online, to scroll past the laughing faces while feeling the sting beneath her ribs. Each omission, each overlooked holiday, each unspoken assumption that she would understand her place in the hierarchy of family importance was a quiet message about her value. She understood it fully, even if no one ever said it. Then came the turning point, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. She stopped expecting recognition. She stopped sending gifts she knew might never be received. She stopped apologizing in advance for being late or inexact or human. She started noticing the life she could craft outside of those omissions, the quiet joy that could exist in spaces where she was fully acknowledged simply by her own presence. The ache didn't vanish. It still existed, a shadow that lingered, but it became less a statement of unworthiness and more of a signal of the life she could claim for herself. And so she began to make choices that prioritized her own peace, her own recognition, her own quiet happiness, without waiting for anyone else's approval or validation. She bought a small house in the mountains, a place with pine-scented air, wide windows, and a horizon that could not be manipulated or forgotten. There were no invitations needed here, no casual omissions, no polite slights hidden in routine. The quiet around her was deliberate and complete, a silence that welcomed her fully rather than reminding her of what she lacked. That house became a mirror of the acceptance she had been denied, a tangible manifestation of a truth she had learned too late to spare herself the years of aching. She did not need to wait for recognition from those who forgot to include her. She could create spaces that acknowledged her entirely, where her value was not contingent on external validation. The mountains taught her patience. The stillness taught her presence, and the sun rising over the ridge each morning taught her that life could unfold in a rhythm independent of exclusion. She could hear the snow settling, see the frost forming on the edges of the window, feel the weight of the cold in her fingertips, and know she mattered because she was there, because she had chosen to show up for herself. The pain of being forgotten didn't vanish. It became part of the terrain of her life, a subtle contour shaping her choices and her empathy, her resilience and her determination. But it no longer defined her entirely. She realized, slowly, that quiet exclusion had been the lens through which she measured her own value for too long, and by stepping into a space that recognized her worth intrinsically, she reclaimed not only her peace, but the power that had always existed inside her, waiting quietly to be claimed. She had always believed that if she waited long enough, they would notice. It wasn't a conscious strategy at first. It started in childhood, the subtle lesson that her presence was optional, her contributions invisible unless highlighted by someone else. A compliment she never received, a gift forgotten, a party where she was assumed absent, all of it layered into her psyche like sediment, settling quietly over the years. She didn't realize how much of her life she had built around that quiet hope, around the idea that if she waited patiently, if she measured her words and controlled her gestures just so, she would eventually be acknowledged for who she was and what she had to offer. It was a slow, imperceptible shaping of identity, a molding that happened in the spaces between the words that were spoken and the silences that went unremarked. She remembered evenings spent in the living room, staring at a muted television, wishing aloud for a connection that never came. Birthday parties that blurred into routine gatherings she was assumed to be too busy to attend. Notes she sent carefully, gifts she wrapped with thought and care, emails that began with warm messages and ended in unreceived acknowledgement. Each attempt was folded into the quiet expectation that one day, the universe, or at least the people who mattered most, would recognize her. But the recognition never arrived. Instead, what she received was a subtle pattern of omissions, overlooked efforts, and polite distractions. And gradually, she learned to measure her self-worth by the patience of her waiting. It shaped every decision she made. Career choices were carefully weighed not only for personal fulfillment, but also for how they might be perceived, how they might earn her approval from those whose opinion had become a silent compass. She deferred her desires, postponed travel, muted her ambitions in subtle ways because she believed recognition would come if she were compliant, if she waited long enough. Opportunities passed quietly in the background, not with a dramatic crash, but in the soft unfolding of time, where she asked herself repeatedly whether she was being unreasonable for wanting more than their acknowledgement. Even friendships were filtered through the lens of waiting, her heart braced for disappointment, her generosity extended as though it were a test. If I give enough, if I show enough patience, will they see me? This habit of waiting became a silent rhythm in her life, an undercurrent that guided everything without her fully noticing. She would celebrate quietly when others recognized her achievements, feeling a surge of validation that was both comforting and destabilizing, because it reminded her how rare it was. She had learned to live in the intervals between acknowledgement, to carve joy from moments that were hers alone. Yet she was never entirely free from the quiet pressure to be seen, to be appreciated, to be measured by someone else's approval. It was a subtle form of bondage, the invisible tether of expectation that she had internalized over decades, shaping the architecture of her life without anyone needing to say a word. The turning points came slowly, often imperceptibly. A compliment from a stranger, a nod from a colleague, a friend's laughter at a joke she thought no one would notice. These moments were like tiny tremors beneath the surface, hinting that recognition could exist outside the family she had long hoped would validate her. She began to see patterns she hadn't before, the small ways she had deferred herself, the times she had silenced her desires, the years she had postponed living fully while waiting for someone else's acknowledgement. It was a revelation, both thrilling and unsettling. She realized that the life she had lived in patient anticipation was real, but it had been shaped more by absence than presence, more by hope than fulfillment. And suddenly, the weight of all those years pressed on her chest with a clarity she could no longer ignore. She started making quiet changes, not in rebellion, not in dramatics, but in subtle acts of self-recognition. She stopped sending the emails that went unacknowledged, stopped adjusting her schedule to match the imagined expectations of others. She began to invest her energy in projects that mattered to her, not in ways that might earn nods or approval. She traveled to places she had dreamed of, even if no one would congratulate her, even if no one would notice her absence at the table. She purchased books she had wanted for years, took courses that challenged her, and rearranged her days so that her priorities came first. These were not grand gestures, only quiet affirmations that she mattered, that her life could be measured not by waiting for validation, but by the depth of attention she gave to her own desires and decisions. Even in relationships, the impact of decades spent waiting for validation became evident. She noticed herself bracing for disappointment, anticipating subtle omissions, calculating how much she would invest emotionally before being recognized in return. At first, it was exhausting. She would catch herself apologizing for being too much or too little, measuring her presence as if it were a currency to be traded for attention. Over time, she learned that waiting for validation from anyone else was optional, a habit she could release. She started to engage fully, with authenticity, with the understanding that recognition might never come, but that her life would still be rich and meaningful without it. She realized that the absence she had once feared could coexist with joy, and that her own attention and care could be sufficient to nourish her spirit. The mountains taught her lessons that years of waiting had only hinted at. She learned that silence was not always empty, that absence could be a space for clarity rather than despair. She would sit on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun rise over trees she could almost touch, and she felt the fullness of her presence without needing anyone else's confirmation. Her past, the years of quiet hope and subtle omission, remained there, but it no longer defined her choices. She understood that waiting had shaped her, yes, but it had also taught patience, resilience, and the ability to find meaning in subtlety. It had given her an intimate understanding of what it meant to be human, to desire recognition, to carry hopes that might never be fulfilled, and yet still move forward with dignity. She began to understand that waiting for validation was a mirror of her own self-perception. Every omission she endured reflected the quiet doubts she carried within, the internalized questions of worth, value, and belonging. By reclaiming her attention, by choosing to act independently of others' acknowledgement, she began to untangle the two, separating the absence of recognition from the absence of her own power. Her life became a series of deliberate acts, small but resolute, making breakfast because she wanted it, taking long walks in the woods because they brought calm, writing letters she didn't intend to send because her thoughts deserved articulation, not approval. In those acts, she found validation inherent, intrinsic, and self-sustaining. She understood with gentle clarity that waiting had not been wasted. It had honed her awareness, refined her empathy, and strengthened her capacity for reflection. But she no longer allowed it to govern her choices. No longer did she defer herself to the invisible measure of others' acknowledgement. She began to notice the subtle joys in her own rhythm, in the quiet satisfaction of work completed for its own sake, in conversations held because she wanted to speak, not because she feared being overlooked. The anticipation that once anchored her to others' approval loosened, replaced by the steady pulse of self-guided attention, by the awareness that recognition, while sweet when it came, was not necessary for her to live fully, to love fully, to feel fully. There were moments of temptation, of course, when old patterns nudged at her consciousness. A message overlooked, a social gathering she hadn't been invited to, a casual comment from someone she once hoped would notice her achievements. All of these threatened to stir old habits. But she met them differently now, with the quiet knowledge that waiting for someone else's acknowledgement was no longer the measure of her worth. She could choose presence, engagement, and attention without expectation. She could cultivate joy in ways independent of validation. And slowly, imperceptibly, the weight of decades of deferred hope began to lift. Even the landscape around her mirrored the shift. Snow fell quietly in the morning, frost formed delicate patterns along the windows, and sunlight touched the edges of pine needles with brilliance that required no recognition. Life moved forward, and she moved with it. The subtle lessons of waiting, the patience, the longing, the resilience, remained embedded in her, but they no longer tethered her to the rhythm of absence. She could breathe fully, without hesitation. She could choose her own steps, measure her own accomplishments, and rest in the knowledge that waiting, while once shaping her life, no longer dictated it. She was present for herself in ways she had never been before, and the freedom of that presence felt quiet, immense, and deeply human. She had spent so many years moving through life as though she were walking in someone else's shadow, careful not to trip over expectations she hadn't agreed to, and measuring every decision against the silent standards of others. Autonomy had seemed like a distant dream, something that existed only in the abstract, a concept whispered about in books she never had time to read, or in moments glimpsed in the lives of people she admired from afar. She had thought that freedom was reserved for those with fewer obligations, those who had inherited permission to claim it. At the same time, she remained tethered to invisible rules, obligations unspoken yet profoundly binding. Even small choices, the ones that should have been effortless, felt weighted with the gravity of approval and judgment. And over the years, she had become adept at carrying that weight without complaint, quietly folding her own desires into the margin, letting them exist in a hushed, half-realized form. The moment she stepped into autonomy, she felt a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, like the first thread of sunlight touching a frosted window. It was not an explosion of freedom, not a dramatic severing of ties or a loud declaration of independence. It was smaller, quieter, a gentle realignment of her attention toward herself. For the first time in decades, she could see her own preferences and intentions without filtering them through the lens of expectation. She noticed that the unspoken judgments of others no longer crowded her thoughts, that she could make choices without rehearsing the imagined objections or silences that had once dominated her inner dialogue. There was a clarity in the simplicity, a lucidity that came from acting not to satisfy, placate, or avoid conflict, but simply to honor the life she had built and the person she was discovering she could be. Autonomy revealed patterns she had never noticed before. She saw the subtle ways her energy had been redirected over the years, projects abandoned because they didn't fit someone else's timetable, invitations declined because they conflicted with imagined obligations, ambitions muted for the sake of convenience or avoidance. It wasn't always deliberate, and no one had imposed it with malice, yet it had taken root in her life like an invisible framework, shaping the very architecture of her days. Now, with a quiet shift of attention inward, she began to recognize that those patterns were not inherent truths. They were inherited expectations, gently worn but not unbreakable. She could disentangle herself from them, thread by thread, decision by decision, and in doing so, she could reconstruct a life that was hers in every sense. The first choices she made independently were almost imperceptible: a longer walk through the neighborhood without a schedule, a cup of tea consumed in the early light rather than during a dictated pause, a notebook opened for her own reflection instead of for the approval of someone else. These small acts felt revolutionary because they were simple and self-directed. She could choose what she noticed, what she attended to, and what she allowed to influence her thoughts. She began to see that autonomy was not merely an external condition, but an internal practice, a daily commitment to prioritize her own perspective, her own rhythm, her own sense of timing. Each decision made on her own terms built upon the last, creating a quiet but persistent momentum that lifted the weight of expectation and clarified the terrain of her life. With clarity came a surprising intimacy with her own thoughts and desires. She could distinguish between what she truly wanted and what she had been taught to want. The distinction was subtle at first, a flicker in the mind's periphery, an almost imperceptible shift in the way she felt when a decision was made. Autonomy allowed her to sit with herself without judgment, to listen to her own inclinations without immediately translating them into obligations or responses for others. She realized that she had spent so long calibrating her actions to the perceived approval of those around her that she had nearly forgotten the shape and texture of her own intentions. This rediscovery was tender and unsettling at the same time. It required patience and a gentle attention, the willingness to feel uncertain and untested while still moving forward. The people around her noticed a change, though it was subtle and unspoken. There was a steadiness in the way she moved through conversations, a quiet confidence in her speech, a lack of hesitation in her choices that did not need to be justified. It was not arrogance, nor was it performative. It was simply the result of not constantly deferring to imagined expectations. The shift was quiet but undeniable. Her presence no longer hinged on validation, no longer required reassurance. She could attend, speak, act, and retreat entirely on her own terms, and in doing so, she observed a change in the dynamics around her. Others who had once assumed her compliance began to recalibrate, recognizing that she was no longer entirely available for their convenience, that her energy was her own. Clarity brought both liberation and discomfort. With autonomy came the responsibility to see clearly the patterns of dependence, the subtle ways she had sacrificed herself for stability, for peace, for the illusion of approval. She had to confront the fact that some relationships, once cherished, had been built on assumptions of compliance, and that her newfound independence would inevitably alter those structures. This realization did not arrive as anger, but as a calm acknowledgement. Freedom is never without consequence, and clarity demands honesty, both with oneself and the world.
She began to engage with these realities not with drama or accusation, but with a quiet, measured assessment of what could remain, what needed boundaries, and what had to be released entirely. The mountain house became a symbol of this autonomy, not merely a physical space, but a declaration of self-determination. It offered her the ability to inhabit her choices fully, to act in alignment with her own desires without interference, without expectation, without negotiation. The silence there was not absence, but presence. It was the presence of a life that could be oriented entirely around her own rhythm, her own vision of comfort and contentment. She could sit on the porch with her coffee, watch the fog roll through the trees, feel the crisp air on her face, and simply exist in the deliberate, unclaimed space she had created. Autonomy, she realized, was the vessel that allowed clarity to flourish. It was impossible to see herself fully if she was constantly attending to the projected expectations of others. She began to notice subtle patterns of thought and emotion that had previously gone unnoticed. The way anticipation of judgment had governed her breathing. The habitual deference had constrained her energy. In the quiet of her chosen space, she could examine these impulses without shame or pressure, recognize them as echoes of past conditioning, and decide, calmly, whether to act on them. Decisions that once felt impossibly heavy became simple acts of presence. What she wanted for breakfast, what path she would take on a morning walk, whether she would write or rest. Each choice, small and seemingly mundane, was a reaffirmation of self, a deliberate act of autonomy that reinforced the clarity she had been seeking unconsciously for decades. She began to understand that autonomy was both shield and lens. It protected her from the subtle incursions of obligation and expectation while allowing her to perceive herself with a fresh perspective. It was the condition that made clarity possible. She could see what she truly valued, what she needed, and what she could let go of without fear. The relationships that had been distorted by reliance and quiet manipulation were no longer invisible to her. She could observe them with the calmness of someone who had stepped back from the tide, unentangled from the currents that once dictated her movement. This clarity was not dramatic, not urgent, but profound. It allowed her to act decisively, to respond with deliberation, and to inhabit her own life fully, entirely, without apology.
She had once believed that love meant giving without question, that loyalty required sacrifice until her own needs disappeared into the shadows of others' expectations. The lines between kindness, obligation, and self-preservation had blurred so thoroughly that she often forgot which impulses were truly hers and which were echoes of someone else's demands. Over time, this indistinction had grown into a quiet exhaustion, a weight pressing on her chest with the subtlety of a low-hanging branch brushing her shoulder. She had tolerated phone calls that left her stomach twisting, requests that trespassed on her time and energy, and invitations that she accepted out of habit rather than desire. And for years, she had believed that the cost of saying no was too high, that asserting herself would fracture the fragile bonds she feared might already be cracking beneath the surface. But then came a moment of quiet reckoning. A small, seemingly insignificant incident, a late-night call asking for help with something that had nothing to do with her, a demand that should have been declined, made her pause. She felt an unfamiliar tightening in her chest, a whisper of resistance she could no longer ignore. It wasn't anger, at least not entirely. It was recognition that her sense of self had been quietly eroded by decades of unspoken concessions. She understood that the freedom she had been cultivating, the autonomy she had begun to taste, required not only choice but protection. Boundaries were not walls of separation, but shields that allowed her to inhabit her own life fully, without constant interference, without the silent guilt that had long accompanied her every act of defiance or compliance. Setting boundaries was not simple. It was a delicate negotiation with herself as much as with others. Each limit she attempted to impose felt like a test of courage, a tremor of anxiety passing through her mind. How would they respond? Would they be angry, disappointed, or dismissive? Could she withstand the tension, the potential conflict, the subtle erosion of affection she had long tied to acquiescence? Yet with every tentative step, she discovered a quiet strength, a reservoir of self-respect that had been hidden beneath layers of deference and expectation. Boundaries required articulation, clear, unwavering, calm, and an acceptance that not everyone would understand or approve. The clarity of her needs became intertwined with her courage, each assertion a small declaration of selfhood she had long neglected. The first boundaries were modest, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but monumental to her. She stopped answering emails outside of work hours, allowed herself to decline invitations that drained her, and paused before committing to favors that felt obligatory rather than chosen. At first, the absence of immediate feedback left her uneasy. She had grown accustomed to constant validation, to the ritual of pleasing others to maintain harmony. Silence and refusal felt like transgressions against an invisible code. Yet with each boundary respected, she felt the space around her expand. The freedom that autonomy had granted her now found form in these protective limits. They were not punitive, they were declarative, stating clearly that her life, her energy, her presence were hers to steward, and no longer to give away reflexively. She began to notice the subtle ways boundaries reshaped her interactions. Conversations, once tense with expectation, became lighter, more genuine. She could participate fully, free from the internal tally of debt and obligation. She observed her own energy in ways she had never permitted before. She noticed when she was drained, when she was content, when she wanted silence or presence, reflection or action. She began to recognize that freedom was not merely the absence of external control, but a continuous dialogue with herself, a practice of noticing, honoring, and protecting the limits of her own mind and body. Boundaries became the scaffolding on which the architecture of her selfhood could stand, solid and unyielding, yet open to the beauty and intimacy she chose to invite. The lessons of boundaries extended beyond personal comfort. She discovered that they allowed her to see relationships in their truest form. The people who respected her limits, who listened and adapted, revealed themselves as allies, genuine and caring. The ones who chafed against her limits, who attempted to guilt or manipulate, were suddenly visible in ways that had been obscured by her habitual accommodation. This clarity was profound. She could differentiate between a connection built on mutual respect and the connection built on dependency or control. Boundaries were not about punishment, they were about discernment. They allowed her to inhabit the world with open eyes, to choose engagement with integrity, and to release entanglements that no longer served her growth. At first, the act of enforcing boundaries created friction. Loved ones tested them, gently or aggressively, as if the rules she had established were new territory to explore or exploit. Her heart would ache in those moments, a mix of empathy and residual guilt, but she learned to endure the discomfort. She understood that the tension was not a failure of love or loyalty, but a natural resistance to change. Relationships had been conditioned over decades to rely on her pliability, and her newfound limits disrupted that rhythm. By holding firm, she was teaching both herself and others that respect was earned through recognition of her autonomy, not assumed by her compliance. Boundaries also created the space for reflection. She could sit with her own thoughts without interruption, notice the nuances of her emotional life, and make decisions with intention rather than compulsion. She discovered that silence, once filled with anxiety, could be restorative. Time spent in reflection, previously stolen in fragmented moments, has now become abundant and sacred. She could breathe fully, consider her priorities, and respond to the world without being swept into reactive patterns that had governed her for years. Every no became a gateway to presence, every refusal an affirmation that her life was hers, fully and without compromise. Even small acts of boundary setting revealed their power over time. She declined a family request for an unnecessary financial favor, and the anxiety that had always accompanied such refusals dissipated more quickly than she anticipated. She told a friend she could not host a gathering, and the relationship remained intact, surprisingly resilient. She refused to answer texts at midnight, and the world continued. With each act, she gained confidence, not only in her decisions, but in the fundamental truth that self-respect was not negotiable. Freedom and boundaries were inseparable. One could not exist without the other, and in that realization, she discovered a profound sense of stability she had never known. The mountain home, with its silence and isolation, became a laboratory for these experiments in self-care and protection. The walls, windows, and surrounding trees offered a tangible space in which to exercise limits without immediate intrusion. She could hear the wind, the distant birds, the slow shift of light across the forest floor. And in that space, her boundaries felt natural,
unassailable, and life-affirming. She realized that boundaries were not impositions on the world, but declarations of inner truth. They allowed her to inhabit her life fully, to act decisively, and to invest her energy deliberately. They were not defenses against connection, but invitations to more authentic connection. Relationships in which she was present by choice, not compulsion. Gradually, she noticed the transformation extending beyond her immediate space. Work, social engagements, and even family interactions shifted in tone. People learned the contours of her limits, some with relief, some with frustration, and she observed the subtle recalibration with quiet satisfaction. The freedom she had cultivated through autonomy and clarity was now reinforced by the protective framework of boundaries, creating a life in which she could engage without erosion, contribute without depletion, and love without losing herself. The very act of delineating her space, physical, emotional, temporal, became a source of energy rather than restriction, a practice of nurturing herself that radiated outward. Through boundaries, she discovered a quiet confidence, a trust in her own judgment, and an understanding that presence, attention, and care were most valuable when chosen freely. She saw that her own energy was finite, that depletion did not serve anyone, and that true generosity arose from fullness rather than exhaustion. Her sense of self expanded not through compliance or acquiescence, but through careful, deliberate protection of her autonomy. Each act of saying no, of asserting a limit, reinforced the clarity of her desires and the strength of her convictions. She realized that freedom was inseparable from these boundaries, that they were not obstacles but frameworks that allowed life to flourish with intention and authenticity. She learned that boundaries were acts of compassion, both for herself and for those around her. They prevented the subtle erosion of her spirit, allowed her to give fully when she chose, and revealed the true nature of the relationships in her life. By protecting her space, she could participate in life with awareness and presence, unburdened by obligations she had not consented to, and unshaken by demands that previously would have swept her into quiet compromise. Boundaries were the quiet guardians of her freedom, and in their practice, she discovered the steady rhythm of a life fully inhabited, a life where clarity, autonomy, and self-respect were inseparable.
She had always imagined courage as a sudden, dramatic act, standing on a precipice, speaking truths that could not be taken back, confronting danger or betrayal in a way that left witnesses in awe. But what she discovered, slowly, quietly, in the days and months after stepping away from obligations that had long defined her, was that courage could also be small, persistent, and almost imperceptible. It lived in the decision to honor her own needs when every fiber of habit and guilt urged her to comply, to give, to stay silent, to defer. Courage was the quiet refusal to allow her life to be dictated by others, the daily act of choosing herself, even when it hurt, even when it meant breaking patterns that had been etched into her existence for decades. The first moments were trembling in their subtlety. She remembered sitting alone on the porch of her mountain house, coffee in hand, watching fog coil around the pines, realizing that the silence was not empty. It was a canvas. No one could intrude unless she invited them. For years, she had thought the world would collapse if she prioritized her own needs. Now she saw that the world continued, and it did so without catastrophe. And yet, the courage required to continue choosing herself felt heavy at first, almost tangible, like carrying a small stone in her pocket that pressed against her hip with every step. She knew that choosing herself would bring joy, yes, but also a confrontation. Perhaps anger, perhaps disappointment, perhaps the subtle withdrawal of those who had grown accustomed to her compliance. She practiced courage quietly, each decision a reinforcement of her inner resolve, declining requests that drained her energy, speaking her truth without embellishment, refusing to be guilted or manipulated. All of these acts felt simultaneously ordinary and monumental. There was no applause, no external recognition. Only the calm, internal understanding that she had done what was necessary to honor her own life. In these small acts, she discovered a strange and profound reward: clarity. The world became less confusing, the relationships around her less weighted with obligation, and her own mind less cluttered with the relentless questions of how to please, how to anticipate, how to prevent disappointment. Choosing herself simplified existence in a way she had never imagined possible. Courage, she realized, was inseparable from acceptance. To act boldly in her own interest, to step fully into autonomy, required acknowledging the truth of her past, the patterns that had shaped her, and the people who had taken her generosity for granted. It required seeing them clearly, not with anger, but with sober recognition. Some loved her conditionally. Some relied upon her to sustain their own comfort, and some simply did not understand what it meant to respect another's boundaries. The recognition of this truth was uncomfortable, like cold water on skin that had long been sheltered from reality, but it was necessary. Courage demanded honesty, not only with herself but with the world she inhabited. She also discovered that choosing herself required patience. Courage was not a one-time act, but a series of continual decisions, each carrying its own weight and potential consequences. She could not control the reactions of others, nor did she seek to. Sometimes she faced anger, sometimes confusion, sometimes disappointment. Sometimes she faced quiet resistance, subtle attempts to pull her back into old patterns. And yet, each day she returned to the practice of prioritizing her own life, affirming her choices, and reinforcing her boundaries. Courage, she realized, was a muscle that strengthened with use, gaining resilience in the repetition of quiet, deliberate decisions. In the solitude of her home, she began to notice the emotional landscape that courage uncovered. She could feel fear, certainly. The fear of confrontation, the fear of disappointment, the fear that by stepping away she had damaged relationships beyond repair. But intertwined with fear was a growing sense of relief, of lightness, of possibility. She discovered that courage did not eliminate vulnerability, it transformed it into agency. She could feel uncertainty without capitulation, acknowledge risk without surrender, and stand in her truth without apology. Choosing herself was not reckless, it was deliberate, intentional, and profoundly human. The family dynamics she had once navigated with quiet compliance became a mirror for the depth of her courage. Those who had relied on her to maintain equilibrium now encountered resistance, firm, and the reactions were telling. Anger, confusion, subtle manipulation, and attempts at persuasion all arrived with the expectation that she would yield. And in yielding, she had once survived. But in refusing, she discovered a strange power. Not power over them, not revenge, not punishment, but power over her own life. She could exist without being pulled into their chaos, without being the anchor that kept their storms from breaking. Her courage protected her from the drain of invisible obligations and allowed her to inhabit her own space fully. She learned that courage was tied to memory, to the quiet remembrance of what she had endured, and to the foresight of what she could now prevent. Every moment she had been erased, ignored, or manipulated became a quiet teacher, whispering that her presence mattered most when it was given freely, not extracted by expectation or obligation. Each act of choosing herself built upon these lessons, creating a lattice of experience that reinforced her clarity and autonomy. She saw the contrast between the life she had led in compliance and the life she could lead in conscious choice, and the contrast was striking, almost luminous in its simplicity. Choosing herself required a recalibration of love. She realized that love, for it to be genuine, could not exist in the absence of respect. She could care for others deeply without surrendering her own needs, could offer compassion without losing sight of her own boundaries. In exercising courage, she learned to discern between attachment and obligation, between responsibility and exploitation, between the genuine desire to connect and the expectation to sacrifice. Her heart could be full, yet unburdened, and this balance became both a refuge and a revelation. She could give and withdraw in equal measure, in a rhythm dictated not by fear, but by clarity and intention. There were moments of doubt, of course, nights when she questioned whether the cost of asserting herself was worth the pain it caused others, mornings when guilt surfaced like a shadow she thought had dissipated, hours when the tension of confrontation lingered long after the words were spoken. And yet, she returned over and over to the quiet affirmation that choosing herself was not selfish, it was essential. The precondition for any authentic engagement with the world. Courage was the act of consistently choosing life on her own terms, of honoring her truth despite discomfort, and of refusing to be subsumed into the desires and expectations of others. In the practice of courage, she discovered a deep, meditative awareness of time and mortality. Life, she realized, was finite, and each moment spent surrendering her will to external pressures was a moment stolen from her own experience. Choosing herself became an act of reverence for the life she had been given. She could embrace its beauty, its quiet rhythms, its ordinary joys without the perpetual undertow of invisible debts and obligations. Courage was no longer a dramatic gesture. It was the simple, daily act of protecting her own presence, her own energy, and her own voice in the world. By the time the seasons shifted, she had grown into a rhythm of deliberate living. Each act of saying yes or no, each decision made with attention to her own needs, reinforced her sense of self and her trust in her judgment. She had learned that courage was not an emergency measure, not a reaction to crisis, but a constant, tender practice of standing in one's own truth. She could encounter the world fully, engage with relationships intentionally, and face conflict without eroding the core of who she was. Choosing herself became both shield and compass, guiding her through uncertainty and preserving her capacity for genuine connection on her own terms. Notice the subtle shifts in how others responded. Some backed away, unable to accommodate the new boundaries, while others approached her with curiosity, respect, and the willingness to adapt. She realized that courage did not demand victory over others, it demanded fidelity to herself. She could navigate the reactions of family, friends, and colleagues without surrendering, without resentment, without apology. The courage to choose herself gave her the ability to remain present, to respond deliberately rather than react unconsciously, and to inhabit her own life with dignity and clarity. Choosing herself, she understood, was not a dramatic finale, but a quiet continuum. It was a practice embedded in ordinary moments, declining an invitation, stating a preference, refusing a favor, honoring her own time, listening to her own intuition, noticing her own fatigue, acknowledging her own joy. Each instance, however small, was an assertion of her right to exist fully, to act with integrity, and to cultivate the life she desired without interference. Courage had transformed from a distant, abstract concept into a daily companion, guiding her in every interaction, every decision, every reflection. And in this steady, continuous practice, she discovered a profound liberation. The tension between obligation and desire, between self and others, between expectation and freedom began to ease. She could breathe without calculation, act without apprehension, and rest without guilt. Courage had taught her that the ultimate act of love for herself did not negate her capacity to care for others, it enhanced it. She could offer her presence freely because it was not extracted, coerced, or assumed. In choosing herself, she had reclaimed her voice, her energy, her time, and her life. And in doing so, she had discovered a power both quiet and unassailable, a resilience born from persistent, deliberate, intimate courage.